All right.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Gérard, for this invitation. Thank you, Emily, for this organization. Thank you, Patrick Sparrow, for being with us. I had planned to give my talk in French, being a Frenchman, but when I heard you would be with us, I said it was my duty to try to give it in English, since I spent 4 years ago. I had a wonderful stay at your library and a very generous fellowship, which I thoroughly enjoyed. I could work on Governor Morris, and I had access to a material, very exceptional material, hoarded in that very particular space. So thank you again for your generosity. So I've entitled my talk, "A Constitution to End the Revolution." I would like to stress the fact that what is important in this title is certainly the question mark, since I'm not going to give a final answer to this very tricky question. Maybe in 2026,
yeah, we
will. Not right now for the opening of this session, and it will be more a question than an answer. Well, it's sometimes very difficult to determine when a revolution sparks off, and even more difficult to try to find out how and when it ends or it fades away. I borrowed this title from Britaix Basco, who is a French historian, and wrote a milestone book on the French Revolution. Its title was "Comment sortir de la terreur?" How to get out of terror, with a question mark again, which was a groundbreaking study of the Thermidorian reaction. It is indeed an established fact that the terror was both a tragic and paroxystic event in the French Revolution, and it is just self-evident that the death of Robespierre did not end the revolution. My object today, therefore, is quite extensive. It's complex, far-reaching, not easy to circumscribe. I've chosen a comparative approach, resting upon a widely admitted idea that there was and still is a logical and ideological link between the French and the American Revolution. Both are issued from the Enlightenment. Both end up with the emergence of a republican system of government to replace the monarchical form that had prevailed so far. And this is true both of France and America, Colonial America. Few historians have denied that the two events have a common source, which, broadly speaking, might be identified as the theory of natural rights. Both French and American historians had, at the same time, indulged in a kind of intellectual posture, which led them to analyze their revolution as a strictly national and original phenomenon that had no equivalent elsewhere. Now, in the 1950s, as you all know, a number of historians in France, Jacques Godechaux, and across the Atlantic, Robert Palmer, signed an article which was published for a conference in Rome entitled "The Problem of the Atlantic." Following this innovative path, a number of prominent historians took their cue, and I'm thinking more particularly of Bernard Bailyn, who published his seminal Atlantic History, Concepts and Contours. Now, my modest contribution to this debate will be embedded inside this very general and far-reaching approach, since next to the European continent, it might be extended to other countries like, for example, Latin America. My question is, what is the best way to end a revolution? That is, to find the means to create an appeased situation after a period of extreme tension. I have a debt, of course, for this questioning to Basco and to his book, but it also arose from the work I made in collaboration with Emily, with my translation and annotation of the diary of Governor Morris during the French Revolution. One of the central issues debated by Morris in his torrential diary was whether the Constitution was the ideal means to set up a stable and balanced republic likely to secure the pursuit of happiness of the Declaration of Independence. Likewise, the French Constitution of 91 was the first republican constitution. It contained as a preamble a Bill of Rights meant to protect the citizens of the kingdom from the overreaching spread of the state that might lead to an arbitrary power. Now, even though Morris never declared himself a citizen of the world like Paine did at the same time, at the same period of time, he was, as far as I know, the only American founder to have a first-hand experience of the two revolutions. He embarked for the old world at the end of 1788, settled in Paris a few months later, and he lived under the assurance that as a constitution maker, he had secured the creation of a just system of government, which in his mind might serve other countries in the Atlantic sphere. That is why his testimony is absolutely essential, even if he behaved sometimes in a very rough manner. He was not a very polite man. And he tended to give lessons to his contemporaries. And of course, these people didn't like his contemptuous attitude. But my point today will be to offer a number of hypotheses that will be debated in the forthcoming events we'll have until 2026. And like Morris, I will not try to impose my views. And I don't have all the answers, unlike him. What I suggest is to follow his intellectual path around the central question of whether there was no other way to end a revolution but by drafting what he called a good constitution. And this expression is used over and over again in his diary, a good constitution. And my first concern will be to discuss the issue of trying to periodize the two events, the two revolutions. In the case of the American Revolution, it could be, well, at first sight, pretty clear and widely accepted that the revolution started after the Stamp Act episode, planned the Tea Party, when the British soldiers and the Continentals had their first real fight around Lexington and Concord, when several colonists were killed. This was in April 1776. And that episode triggered the revolutionary process and led to the adoption of the Declaration of Independence. Concerning now the end of the revolution, two dates might be summoned. Either 1783, that is the signing of the Treaty of Paris, which put an end to the military operations, and a treaty by which Britain endorsed the sovereignty of the former colonists over their states. After all, this was a revolution, as you said before. At that point, many issues were still pending. What kind of organization was necessary to tackle the issues the 13 states were confronted with? How would an abysmal debt be reimbursed when the government failed systematically to raise taxes? What kind of union was to be set up? and was the loose bond between the former colonies likely to meet the difficulties that the Confederation was confronted with. In that context, many scholars, commentators, historians concluded that 1787 was a preferable date and landmark. It was the key event of the period. It was the drafting of the Constitution in the summer of 1787, which allowed for the emergence of a nation to replace a collection of pre-existing sovereignties. Hence, the prevailing view that the Constitution had ended the revolution. In France, now, the revolution originated in a series of backdrops, as we all know, leading to a famine in Paris and the provinces, with the people exasperated by what they perceived as monumental injustice. And in that context, of course, the storming of the Bastille triggered the revolution, and that date is part of the national heritage. Now, things are more complex when trying to date precisely the end of the revolution. After the failed attempt to overthrow absolutism and to replace the system by a constitutional monarchy, after the Reign of Terror and its most extreme radical developments, after the Directoire, it is admitted by many historians that the coronation of Napoleon on December the 2nd, 1804, is a credible and pertinent landmark. And the famous painting by, how do I switch that? Yeah, the famous painting by, well, you all know that painting, obviously, but I still show it to you, brings evidence through a number of symbolic actions. Oh, it doesn't work on the, I'm sorry. I thought it would be on the screen. Well, you all know so my PowerPoint is useless, like yours.
It's worse than useless.
So this painting brings evidence through a number of symbolic actions that monarchy is dead and replaced by the Republican form. Napoleon puts the crown on his own head. And this is the sign of a major revolution, that is a switch from monarchy to republicanism. He should be kneeling before the Pope, but the Pope is sitting behind him. And the Pope should normally, in the Catholic tradition, put the crown on his head. Now, the Pope is left side or left behind. And of course, therefore, he is deprived of his spiritual powers, and he simply attends a ceremony that might be equated to his own personal downfall. This very symbolic scene is certainly a key moment in the history of the French nation. Now, is it the end of the revolution? The answer is no. And there was a long debate among historians, French historians, and on that issue, and I will simply mention the case of the books by François Furet, especially his Histoire de la Révolution, which was absolutely essential, and which runs from 1789 until 1880. That is the Third Republic, the beginning of the Third Republic. So nearly a century of revolution, of post-revolution, let's say, going through, of course, 1830, 1848, etc. Now, it again, and this is a question that was said before, it would be relevant to raise now the question of the nature of the revolution. It is admitted, or it was long admitted, that the French Revolution was violent, see what Hannah Arendt wrote about it. It gave rise to a major bloodshed. And to the contrary, the American Revolution is portrayed as a legitimate movement, a movement of liberation without paroxystic events conducted by well-born and highly educated leaders, a sort of gentleman's agreement. On this specific point, it would be relevant to remind that in proportion to the population, the revolution caused more casualties than the Civil War. And this is a point which is often forgotten. Now, it is common to use the expression sister republics to qualify, and I'll refer you to the works of Britaix on that issue. Pain is certainly the embodiment of that, of this specific bond, a specific link between the two countries. So the American Revolution, construed as a pacific divorce and not as a radical upheaval. And yet things are not as clear-cut as all that. There was indeed, for example, no formal abolition of privileges. There was no night of the 4th of August in America, of course. And George III was not guillotined, stayed alive. Now, for all, well, these facts, colonial America was not the land of equality, as you said before. The Declaration of Independence didn't create equality. Yes, it was not. Colonial America was not the land of equality, as advertised by such writers as Crèvecoeur, for example. And the first hour revolutionists were certainly animated by a spirit of revolution when they planned to rid the continent, for example, of an oligarchy of planters and northern merchants. The world of the plantation was dominated by a few families who controlled not just the economic sphere, but also the political one, through patronage, through a network of influential gentlemen who had the upper hand on the electoral process. And the insurgents were hell-bent upon replacing such obsolete forms and to pave the way for the emergence of what they call the natural aristocracy. And this is a theme very dear to Britaix, of course. Dependent on individual talents and personal qualities and not birth. Meritocracy should replace aristocracy in that new world, thus brushing aside the old world inherited from the British example, and notably its unfair electoral system with rotten boroughs and pocket boroughs, which was, of course, well, the reverse, the contrary of democracy. So what is commonly referred to as the spirit of 1776 gave rise to, in some states, not everywhere, to major improvements and reforms concerning, for example, primogeniture and reforms which gave new rights to daughters and widows to whom inheritance was granted for the first time. It was a limited reform indeed, but which would have been unthinkable in the previous period. The third example we might take is, of course, that of slavery. The revolution of 1776 did not abolish, bring about a global abolition of slavery. But at the same time, the northern and middle states, one by one, put an end to the practice of bondage. It was only a limited progress, but it couldn't be otherwise, since under the Confederation, each state retained its own sovereignty. So there was no global reform that could be implemented. So the spirit of 1776 was a crucial element to undermine the authority of the monarch through a clear transfer of sovereignty to the people, and to the people construed as an organic whole, despite the differences of status and wealth. And the notion of equality was at the center of the revolution of 1776. What remained to be done was putting an end to the revolution at a time when commercial tensions among the states, plus the problem of the debt, both domestic and foreign, plus a weak constitution, the Articles of Confederation, had gradually emerged among, clearly endangered the fragile equilibrium of the decade. So a consensus emerged that the Constitution of 1787 had created the conditions of a new pacified era. America would henceforth enjoy an unprecedented prosperity, and that utopia, or that utopian view of America, was largely exemplified by many writers, among them, of course, Krefker. Governor Morris himself, though he had his very, very personal view, he was very familiar with Paine, and he was visited by Paine almost every day when he was in Paris, and he had to give him money because the guy was always broke. He always needed money for something. So I disliked him after a while. He was fed up with Paine, and but at the same time, I mean, he didn't share his views at all. And when Paine was imprisoned in 1794, he wrote a letter asking Morris, even though we are very different men, even though we are opposed on many issues, please get me out of prison. And the answer was no. And Paine had to wait until Morris was replaced by Monroe, and then, of course, he was released from prison. But he did indulge himself in that utopian view of America. And he used poetry, as he does sometimes in his diary. So I would just read a few lines. Tomorrow, laborious, I write all the day to friends are far over the water away, who dwell on that soil to our bosom so dear, which so oft from your eye draws the final tear. That dear natal soil, freedom's favorite side, where bliss flows spontaneous, and virtue grows wide, where nature, disdaining the efforts of art, gives grace to the form and gives worth to the heart. He was a real poet in his own way. In his own way. Now, should we give full credit, of course, to that adulterated view of America? The answer is again no. And well, it's simple. I will just take the three examples I just mentioned. The concept of a natural aristocracy, well, it would take some time to create a natural aristocracy, and the situation in the South and the situation on the plantations was not altered by the revolution of 1776. A number of families kept their power intact. And they had, of course, they had put pressure on the convention to obtain that slavery should be abolished, because, as they said, it was a necessity. So they agreed to put an end to the slave trade, but that would be in 20 years' time, not right away, which gave time to planters to renew their stock, see if I may say so. And if you take the families, for example, you have the Delaney's or the Pigneys, and in Philadelphia, you have two Pigneys to represent the South. Two Pigneys, not just one, two, belonging to the great families. Now, concerning the rights of women, yes, as I said before, there were limited progress, but it certainly failed to bridge the gap between men and women. There were marginal reforms carried out in some states, as I said, not throughout the Confederation, but the status of women remained largely unchanged, and never was it seriously contemplated to give them the right to vote. So the aggregation this year is the right to vote, women's suffrage from 1776. I mean, I don't know what my colleague will have to say about 1776. It's a great vacuum as far as the representation of women is concerned. A third point, of course, slavery. Slavery is certainly the most striking example of the distance between the expectations of 76 and the reality of 1787. The decision made by the Philadelphia Conventions clashed most dramatically with the aspiration derived from the Enlightenment. The Constitution, as I said, does not outlaw the institution, and it engraves it in the fundamental law of the land. And of course, this would be one of the causes of the Civil War that would break out, 80 years later, which may mean that, I mean, the revolution was not ended since the problem hadn't been solved. The problem of slavery hadn't been solved by the Convention of 1787. So, as far as Morris is concerned, slavery is never mentioned, even though he was himself an abolitionist. He was opposed to slavery, because he was a New Yorker, certainly. There was no economic necessity to slavery in New York or in the New England or the Middle States. And he said nothing, he says nothing, not a word about slavery in his torrential 1,500 pages, okay? Not a word about slavery, even though, of course, he often visited Jefferson, who lived in a comfortable home on the Champs-Élysées, surrounded by his daughters and his slaves. So Jefferson was living with slaves in Paris, which was illegal, of course, on French soil. But at the same time, leaving aside the problem of slavery, Morris just simply declared that the Declaration of Independence was a landmark in the history of liberty in the United States. Now, wait a minute. Oh, yeah. So he, in Paris, of course, will follow the French, the events of the revolution with all its dangers and excesses. The US Constitution, to him, had brought an happy ending to the popular upheaval which had been necessary to the life of the nation, and symmetrically, so to speak, he postulates that this event is promised to a bright future in the old world, and France, where he stays, will set the example to be emulated by others. By doing so, he simply leaves aside the fact that the ratification of the Constitution in America has not obliterated all the issues that the young nation had to cope with. It does not give a final answer to the issue of federalism, for example, the division between the federal government and the states' rights. This was a matter that would be discussed, and that would be, again, one of the causes of the Civil War. So after the consensus of the first Washington administration, the rulers will clash over that division of power. And this, of course, led to the emergence of the two-party system in America. And it was that famous spirit of compromise, celebrated by Madison in the Federalist Papers, which enabled the delegates to come out with a constitution based on the notion of divided sovereignty, a notion which was in contradiction with the dogma set by the philosophers of the Enlightenment. Madison himself had, in the first stages of the convention, declared that sovereignty could not be divided, that it was one whole. And at the end of the debates in September 1787, Madison had to defend a text in which sovereignty was divided between being a citizen of the nation, of the United States, and being a citizen of one specific state. At this point, of course, is deliberately disregarded by Morris, whose unique conclusion from the American experience is that after years of uncertainty, both political and military, the country had set up an institutional fabric with a bicameral system and a powerful executive likely to bring about peace and stability throughout the nation. In the first stages of the revolution in Paris, Morris seemed to comprehend and to approve what was going on in Paris, although he regretted the violence exercised by what he called the populace. On July 22nd, for example, he described in his diary the horrific scene of Foulon, whose body was carried in triumph by the mob, his head on a spike, his body dragged naked on the earth. And he exclaimed, "Gracious God, what a people." And that exclamation tells much about Morris and how about he will thenceforth adapt his political ambitions for his country of residence and develop his analysis of the French Revolution. It was for that people that Morris decided to put pen to paper and to write a constitution that would bring about stability and pacification to the Kingdom of France. To a certain extent, he follows in the footsteps of the French Assembly with the first constitution of 1791. Most of the members were confident that the way to end the revolution was by eradicating absolute monarchy and replacing it by a constitutional form of power. So at that point, there was no formal opposition between the project of constitution defended by the Assembly and Morris's own approach. He considered himself a specialist in constitution making, since of course he had attended the Philadelphia Convention, and was in a position to give lessons to a set of unprepared French people. And Morris will very quickly become critical and reject a text he considers doomed to failure since it suffers from original and fatal flaws. The day the text was made public, Morris engaged in a lobbying activity among the members of the government, and particularly Monsieur de Montmorin, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, with a view to opening the eyes of the ruling elite in France to the tragic and unavoidable consequences of adopting a set of rules which would precipitate the country into chaos. What is striking is in his attitude is his stubbornness and the faith he had in his own judgment. And at the same time, his action is in many respects pathetic, since the people in power will never take his suggestions seriously. Although he thought he was close to the king. He will try on and on to impose his views, to cause the ministers to change their minds and warn the assembly of that mistake. When asked by William Short his opinion on the Constitution of France, he bluntly replied, it was a ridiculous one. And after it was implemented, he wrote to Washington that every day, quote, every day proves more clearly that their new constitution is good for nothing. And he blames the Constitution on two fundamental points. First of all, the adoption of monocameralism. And second point, the fact that the king was not given an absolute veto on the decision of the legislature. And on the first point, he constantly refers to the example of Pennsylvania and its monocameral assembly. And he says this is the worst constitution in force in the young nation. And secondly, of course, the suspensive veto deprived the king of all the power that should be placed in the hand of the executive branch. I have to conclude. I have to conclude. Okay, well, I have to conclude that. I would just say a few words about the constitution that he had prepared and planned. First of all, he considered that in its draft, what was necessary for France was a monarchy and not an elective monarchy. So dear to Bolingbroke, France needed a hereditary monarchy. Second point, the power of the purse, the power of raising taxes should be the privilege of the representative body. This was taken directly from the American Constitution. Third point, and that is very strange in the mouth of this very irreligious and profligate man, the declaration that religion is the basis of good morals. Therefore, education should teach the precepts of religions and the duties of man towards God. This man had never believed in God all his life, and he inscribed in the Constitution the fact that it should be a religious, it should contain religious elements. In other words, in his mind, what was necessary for France was a king who would exercise almost unlimited powers, since he would be the commander-in-chief of the forces, both again taken directly from the Constitution. And as far as the legislative branch was concerned, he borrows directly from the US Constitution, went a bit further, arguing that the system should be bicameral, with a lower branch consisting of only 100 members, just 100 members, and its power counterbalanced by a strong Senate composed of 90 hereditary senators in the male line of primogeniture appointed by the king. So what is that? In conclusion, my question was, is the Constitution the right way to end the revolution? And I will refer to a conversation between himself and Lafayette in 1792. When Maurice tells him he should fight for a good constitution for his country, for the wretched paper which bears the name, he asks what Maurice means by a good constitution and whether it should be an aristocratic one. And Maurice replied, yes, definitely, adding that a popular government was good for nothing in France. In other words, in Maurice's view, the only way out of the French Revolution was by a counter-revolution, going back to square one. what Maurice learned from his stay in Paris is that the American experience could not be transferred to the old world, and to the case of the French nation in particular. And hence, of course, the underlying belief in the exceptionality of America that simply leaves aside the fact that the Constitution of 1787 may also be construed as a soft transition towards a stricter and more consolidated form of government, and therefore a soft counter-revolution. But since we are going to talk about the Atlantic world, my conclusion will be to say the Atlantic world is definitely not a coherent entity, but rather an aggregate of distinct and diverse units in which a common denominator was and still is hard to find. Thank you.
We have time for question now.
We have time for
You
questions.
have one?
Okay, I have one. I love the title of your talk.
Thank
When
you.
I first saw it, because I thought it was
Not
very
just
astute.
the title. I
No,
hope.
and then I listened to it, but the title, I thought the title was very astute. And the first thing I thought of is Fiore's book, that he ends the revolution in the 1880s, and it made me think, how and when does a revolution end? And this perception is different from contemporaries, of course. Most of them are relieved it ends, I would think. And gradually in the historiography. So I think you're it's not just the constitution, but I see what you mean by would a revolution be worth it without a constitution?
Yes.
And I thought about the American case, obviously, that the Articles of the Confederation were adopted in 1781, and the revolution was far from over, or was it? Okay. And so I thought it raised a lot of questions. And just, well, I'm not an expert of Governor Morris, but I was wondering if religion for him, okay, not for him, but for the people, perhaps to keep them in check.
Yeah, well, why not? Yeah. Yeah, certainly. This man was all but a Democrat. He believed that there were two categories of people, the elite to which he belonged and the rest of the people. And the rest of the people were many, of course, were the overwhelming majority. But he was not really concerned with them. Now, in Paris, for example, he lived in, a very exclusive place near the Champs-Élysées. He went to the Palais Royal every day, and sometimes even, I'm not going to give any details about his personal and sexual life, but he lived in that. And even in Paris, what is very striking is that he was, before the revolution erupted, he heard about there was some tension, and the troops had to use their muskets, and he said, "Well, I guess it's not very serious. It's not very serious because it seems to be very far away from them. It does not belong to that world." And in the case of religion, certainly. But I mean, this is another question. But I wonder if it was not the case for. I mean, it's probably considered that the Catholic Church was so powerful, its presence was so overwhelming that the French couldn't do without it. They had to have that religion, which concerned, 98% of the population. So let them have this. Well, it would have been impossible to recreate the American example in France. I mean, with the notion that there would be 100 or 1,000 denominations, they would live side by side, and there would be the First Amendment to protect them from to live according to their faith. So this is certainly, I mean, this man, even though he was a Republican, was at the same time an aristocrat, and he tended to use the people, and to instrumentalize them. This is, well, what I drew as a conclusion from spending many months and years with him, you know.